the special report on presidential power, its limits, as Donald Trump tests the executive branch's power, going farther than his own controversial first term. Indeed, he harkens back to presidents who had court clashes over bigger things like wartime powers or when the president may act alone. What wartime leaders like Roosevelt and Truman viewed as a last resort, though, carefully weighed with their experts, with their lawyers, and the nonpartisan civil service that they respected, well, in contrast to that, President Trump has just been rushing towards a first plan without any of those efforts to push these powers, sometimes even when flatly banned by the Constitution, sometimes in ways that his own officials have said is reckless, and when warned by his own aides that he could still lose, and even when it invites a string of losses that he's been facing in these first 7 weeks, including new setbacks and losses in court this week alone. We can show you that on our tracker. Not a single win this week, and largely a losing record over the past several weeks. This is all driven by a strategy that you might call Sharpie first. Sign it and see what you can get away with. And that's actually partly different from Trump's first term when he pushed some orders that were knocked down in the courts. You might remember that. But I want to be clear, and I'm going to walk this through with you on our special report right now. Many things that he did do also followed past norms. Simple example, exit a climate accord. Presidents could do that, just as Biden, after his election, rejoined that same climate accord. That's valid. But this term, President Trump has picked a different strategy. For starters, there's the volume you might have noticed, doubling the orders from his first term. He's rushed out an unusually high 89 executive orders, signing more in the first 10 days than any recent president did in their first 100 days.
President Trump has reshaped the government with a flurry of executive orders.
All we have to do is flood the zone.
He has just signed a number of these executive orders.
Just overwhelmed the opposition.
The flurry of executive orders has been head-spinning.
It has been an unprecedented situation to have dozens and dozens of executive orders within the first week.
They'll bite on one and we'll get all of our stuff done. Bang, bang, bang. These guys will never be able to recover.
The initial rush could seem overwhelming to track, but that doesn't mean there's no way to ever, quote, recover, as Trump campaign vet and convict Steve Bannon argued there, especially if many of these orders ultimately fail to stay on the books, if they just lose in court. So the legal history is instructive. Donald Trump likes to argue that he is a unique disruptor. And there's something funny I've mentioned to you before if you watch this program. His critics sometimes strike a similar note. They make Trump sound like every single thing he does in government is unprecedented or that extreme. But the history is more layered. Trump is pushing limits. He is breaking ground with some orders that are flatly illegal under current precedent, while in both parties, most presidents have avoided that out of respect for the rule of law, sometimes out of a general idea that getting knocked back a bunch early in your term wastes capital and time. But as mentioned, there have also been these intense times in history where presidents did try to do more with executive power. Take those wartime eras that I briefly mentioned, where you had bold government and you certainly had more public unity across America. Note the comparison here. Only Presidents Truman and FDR come close on total orders. Truman with 52 in those first 100 days and FDR with over 90. It depends slightly on how you count executive actions in that era. But they were combating existential threats from World War II and then its aftermath, which of course came after a punishing depression. FDR famously wielding his powers and taking on bankers to try to rewrite labor and business law basically on the fly. He also tried to change the Supreme Court itself with a court packing plan, which not even Trump has tried, by the way, or perhaps yet. And Truman, a veteran, tested using those war powers like FDR to take control completely of domestic businesses. Again, testing what the courts would do while also trying to reform the military.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency.
I and so many other men and women of color who have served this nation in uniform owe so much to President Harry S. Truman. He used an executive order. Why not a law? Because you could not have gotten a law passed in the Congress of the United States in 1948.
Colin Powell speaking about it personally. He's someone who, of course, served his country in many roles. And you heard the rationale there. Sometimes you test and push the power. You know Congress won't give it to you. So you see if it's lawful. In that case, talking about Truman integrating the military, what many see as a high point. It's a long ways from that kind of power and pushing boundaries for those kind of goals to what Trump is doing in the current strategy. And I say strategy based on the evidence. This is not just some legal blundering into a bunch of court losses. These aren't just mere PR tactics like so many Trump antics. This is not, based on what we know, just some executive order version of hulking out. And by the way, it's not just overwhelming everyone like Steve Bannon said. Remember, Bannon ran the winning 2016 campaign. He's strategic enough to know you don't announce the entire playbook while you're running the plays against the other team. And so let me show you what our reporting suggests about this strategy right now. This Trump executive order playbook is, one, the rush of orders. Some standard, like I mentioned, some very questionable, and many likely flatly unlawful under the current precedents. That's one. Two, and this is different, lean into these court challenges and fast-track your appeals. The Trump administration has now been asking judges over these past 7 weeks to do something most administrations do not do. Take the cases, rush the answers. Basically, they want this fight. They've been filing these emergency appeals, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Anything to speed up the cases that are, remember, challenging whether Trump even has these powers under executive orders. It's the opposite of Trump's entire legal strategy over the previous 4 years in his own criminal cases, where he tried to run out the clock and ask for more time and then got the Supreme Court to delay the biggest trial he faced so much that it didn't happen by the election. If you're hearing my voice, you probably follow the news. You probably remember that, all the delays. And some of his supporters said it's only fair. These were unprecedented cases. Many critics said it was a kind of cynical tactic to run out the clock, but certainly you remember the delay, right? Well, now they've gone from delay to a sprint, often welcoming. What we can show you are now over 100 legal challenges to many of those executive orders written by Trump to try to seize powers that are so extensive that often they're ripe for suing. Again, you can't just privately sue the president over anything, but if he's clearly crossing the lines and you don't have a frivolous claim and you have standing, there you go. And that means Trump plans have been paused or quickly stopped. And that's because judges can definitely step up and stop something more quickly if it already just flatly violates past rulings. It's called an easy case. So when Trump's order claimed he could just personally rewrite the Constitution about citizenship, it was swiftly blocked. It remains blocked as of tonight, because past cases have long ruled presidents can't do that. What would a Constitution stop if any president could rewrite it? Now, that's a contrast, as I mentioned, to other administrations where big court rulings against presidential orders and executive actions often came much later. They came many months later than Trump's recent setbacks. Now, presidents in recent history on both sides have faced this, but I'm going to explain to you what you're about to see shows just how much later they did than Trump.
Critics outraged at President Bush. 9 states, from Maryland to Maine, New York to New Hampshire, now in a legal battle, filing suit asking the U.S. Court of Appeals to review the Bush administration's plan.
The states claim the administration exceeded its authority.
A setback tonight for the Obama administration's efforts to expand stem cell research. A federal judge has temporarily blocked federal funding of embryonic research.
That Bush setback was 10 months in. It was later, a year into the Obama term, when you saw veteran anchor Brian Williams report on that setback on stem cell research. A lower court had stopped Obama's order. Later, Obama won that case on appeal, again, a year into the term. History shows most presidents just want to avoid a string of those kind of losses. But Trump, in his first term, found some early setbacks on immigration, you might remember. But even in that term, he had fewer orders than now. Protesters did zero in on the legal challenges then. But today, it's a different story. Trump has gone from delaying everything to asking his DOJ lawyers to run to court as fast as they can. We've gone from procrastination to a kind of 400-yard dash. Take that recent emergency request to the Supreme Court. That was a case Trump was losing. And it's not just PR. Speed is the strategy.
If a judge does block one of your policies, part of your agenda, will you abide by that ruling? Will you comply?
Well, I always abide by the courts, and then I'll have to appeal it.
Trump responding to court setbacks. We just walked through the unusually large run of orders, over 100 cases pending on presidential power, and Trump moving to fast-track them, which is a shift in strategy. Most presidents want to limit how much capital they might spend on this kind of thing. Trump, as I mentioned, has a strategy of pushing the orders, fast-tracking the claims, and then the final step is seeing how much help he can quickly get from the Supreme Court that he has pushed to the right. Now, judges will tell you they rule by law, not party. But our politics are polarized, and the court increasingly is. Consider that Republican John Roberts and the 3 Democratic appointees largely still follow independent law, but others, Alito, a MAGA partisan, and Thomas, who literally pockets gifts that dwarf his salary, have shown how they enrich themselves and rule. The court has broken a half-century of precedent to overrule Roe, and it made new precedent with the immunity ruling for Trump. So while FDR faced a court hostile to his agenda and rights for labor, he challenged the rule of law with a very controversial court-packing plan. But Trump, by contrast, faces one of the friendlier courts of the modern era that has proven to have very partisan members. So while we hear about the court as a final guardrail against Trump's efforts, we now have a transactional president betting the court will give him transactional MAGA help. Trump's approach and the fast-tracking strategy I've told you about, on the one hand, recognizes that the legal system is a check on his power. But it also shows the view that he thinks he might bend this very system to get new powers. And that's the evidence of the strategy. You can see it in the number of orders, the emergency appeals, and Trump's desire to just test and see what happens. And Trump's Supreme Court lawyers, like the ones he tapped who waged the immunity advocacy, which argued presidents could murder opponents, these are the hardliners pushing this. So how's the strategy working? The early rulings, of course, are not the end of the road. But we know something only because Trump asked for it in that emergency request I mentioned. A majority of 5 votes emerged against Trump on seizing spending powers. Those are almost always reserved to Congress. The court rejecting what was the emergency request. Trump wanted them to basically let him freeze spending that Congress had approved. And Amy Coney Barrett joined as the, quote, crucial 5th vote, as the Times put it. So when you're reading the legal tea leaves, the big news in the Trump immunity ruling that I mentioned earlier was, of course, he got a win. But even there, remember, Barrett also partially rejected Trump arguments and joined the liberal justices about how criminal evidence could be used. The detail may sound moot, but she ruled against Trump on that before the election that was settled by under 2 points. Had he lost, the Barrett ruling against him would have been applied in a Trump trial. And remember, Trump's whole history here, in the one case that did go to trial where he was convicted in New York, has become a Rorschach test for our era. Many view his criminal history and that conviction as an embrace of criminality that's bad. But Trump has a mugshot framed and hanging like a badge of honor now in his White House. And MAGA allies often view that as proof that law can be broken and changed with raw power, not viewing law as something that should constrain everyone, including the powerful. So this does come back to power. You don't need to go to law school to understand that. The founders divided it between the president, Congress, and the courts because they knew power-hungry tyrants were a threat. What would they say today, watching Republicans in Congress limit its own power that was supposed to be a check on the executive, and watch a Supreme Court have at least several members and sometimes a majority that seems ready to hand the president new powers? Trump's strategy is serious. I've shown you the steps, and it is concerning. To quote another power-hungry entertainer, the system broken, the schools closed, the prisons open, we ain't got nothing to lose, we rolling. No one man should have all that power. Stop tripping. I'm tripping off the power. The clock's ticking. I just count the hours. End quote. The warning of one poet who spoke from apparent experience of power tripping, and tricking MAGA fan Kanye West. Well, now the clock is actually ticking for the Supreme Court's next moves and a nation that will face the consequence of any further power trips it authorizes.